without ever saying, don't trick or treat, don't dress up, don't do whatever it is that you're going to do revolving around this satanic holiday. Falling short of saying any of that, all they have to do is pull out that one verse. Well, there's two verses. The one from Philippians and the one from 1 Thessalonians about avoiding the very appearance of evil. Aren't we supposed to be avoiding the very appearance of evil? And aren't there particularly evil connotations to what goes on with Halloween? Well, no, there really aren't. We've just been told that there are. So our brains start working in that direction, and everything now feels like it's evil if it's associated with Halloween.
It was very confusing because I really didn't know what way to think about it.
I decided to just be a good parent.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to be the good Christian parent and let my kid do the things that kids are going to do.
Welcome to Unbound,
A podcast for new atheists,
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals.
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle, and it's time to get unbound. Hi, I'm Spider. And I'm Shelle.
And it's our Halloween episode. Ooh. It's creepy time. Creepy time is upon us. And I really have been looking forward to putting this episode together. In particular, took the Halloween thing out of the bag the very first October. So now next October, I get to come up with 4 unique things about this time of year to talk about. And I'm actually already working on it. I've got ideas in my head for future episodes. And I'm saying that really seems like a good October episode.
Yeah.
So I'm tucking a few of these ideas away. And we're going to get to them in due time.
Yeah.
But for tonight, we want to talk specifically about Halloween and the evangelical obsession with evil and why we've been led to believe that all of this fun and candy and everything else is somehow evil or linked to the devil. And I want to start out by simply giving a little bit of history of Halloween. There are reasons. There are reasons why some people, and not just evangelicals, but people in general, have kind of a jaded and sort of negative view of what Halloween is, because it hasn't always been just about fun and candy.
Of course.
So we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight too, and some of the perspectives that I got on this time of year from Wicca, some of the things that I have carried over into my atheist life, and going to issue an interesting challenge toward the end for those of you who are listening and who are still in evangelical faith and want to learn a little bit more about the way people approach certain more of the macabre aspects of this time of year.
Right.
So Halloween, also known as All Hallows Eve, also known as Samhain in pagan circles, happens on October 31st. Duh. I mean, who doesn't know when Halloween is? But in pagan traditions, Samhain is the day or around the time, let's say around the time, when the veil between worlds is thinnest and you're supposedly more able at that point to commune with people who have gone before.
Right.
Not just people. There are a lot of people out there that include their pets.
Yes.
And we saw quite a bit of that at the couple of Samhain rituals that we did. People were remembering both people and pets, which I thought was really neat.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk in depth about the concept of remembrance in a little while too. But as a Wiccan, because of this whole concept of the veil thinning between the worlds, I had convinced myself that I was able to contact certain people, including my best friend who died when we were 11. I was convinced that I had contacted my father at some point, my grandmother, and, settling some old business, because it's unfortunate, but there are people who were in my life who have now passed on, with whom I definitely had some unfinished business.
Oh, same, yeah.
And it's a tough thing to live with. So if I can give you a little bit of early advice on this, give forgiveness where it's due. Even if it's not due, give forgiveness. Talk to people. reason out your problems with people because it's a tough spot to be put in. And the whole aspect of being able to contact people who have gone before, it puts a good Band-Aid on it. But then when you figure out the reality of the situation, you really do find yourself in a position of understanding just how important it is to not leave things unfinished with people. It hurts.
Yeah.
And it can do a lot of emotional damage. So that's one little bit of advice that I will give you. You got a gripe with somebody, settle it. Figure out some way to either settle it or be okay with it, forgive it, and move on. It's really the only way that you're going to find any real peace with this. You don't want to do what I've done in a couple of situations and let things go to the point where nothing ever gets resolved.
Right.
So that's the practical, rational, and reasonable way of dealing with this. But at that point in our lives, this put enough of a Band-Aid on it for me to be able to be a little bit more at peace with some of those situations, and also at peace with some of the more disturbing things that happened, especially with my best friend, and being able to see visualizations of him in my head where we were about the same age and having conversations on a more adult level. Obviously, it all came out of my head, but it was a coping mechanism. And a lot of the traditions that revolve around this time of year are just that. They're coping mechanisms designed to help you deal with loss.
Right.
So we'll go into more detail about all of these things as we move along. But there's a few days period in here that is significant. Starts on October 31st, extends out to November 2nd. October 31st is, again, All Hallows Eve. And then that's followed directly by All Saints' Day on November 1st, which is a Remembrance Day. And then All Souls' Day on November 2nd.
Right.
So the Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, actually overlaps those 3 days. It starts on October 31st and extends through November 2nd. So in terms of a day, it has more to do with the sundown, sunup aspect of things. Right. So it kind of extends over a day. But when you look at the time frame here, it's just like saying that Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days. Well, it wasn't really 3 days. It was more like a day and a half.
Yeah.
And that's the way that this particular festival is celebrated. And I know it's interesting that I would use a word like celebrate for something that has to do with death, but that is what it is. That really is what the Day of the Dead is. And a lot of our celebrations, a lot of the things that we do around this time of year are hybrids of a bunch of different traditions. And some of them are theistic and some of them are purely secular. But there is a pagan aspect to pretty much all of it, just like there is with any holiday.
Yeah.
I mean, there's as much pagan influence in Christmas as there is in Halloween, and probably more.
There's more.
There's definitely more. But just looking at a few of the little traditions that make up this time of year. Bobbing for apples. Now, this was a new one for me.
Yeah.
I really wasn't aware, because anytime that I've participated in this, it's just been a fun game. Like, who can do it?
Right.
But bobbing for apples it's a pagan practice that allegedly is supposed to tell women who they're supposed to marry.
Yes,
like,
there's a lot of games on and around Halloween that is supposed to tell women, like, there's the initial of the man you're going to marry, or, whoever you're going to marry. That was a very big concern.
Oh, yeah.
For a lot of women.
And especially since this time of year is considered to be the pagan New Year.
Yeah.
So it's a fresh start. And now you're going out and looking for what your future is going to look like.
Yeah.
And you're trying to determine who you're going to spend that future with.
Yeah.
And that was the origin of bobbing for apples. I've done this many, many times. And it's just, something that you do for fun. I was always very, very determined. I was one of the few that would really get my head wet and really get in there to get those apples. But I never thought of it in terms of new relationships or any outside meaning. So it's one of those things, and almost all of these things have become very secularized over time. I was reminded of the fable of Jack-o'-lantern, which a lot of people don't know. I've heard many, many different versions of why we carve pumpkins and
Right.
do the whole Jack-o'-lantern thing. But it's a fun little story about a not very nice guy who he basically traps Satan in a tree by carving a cross into the tree. So now Satan can't get out of the tree. So the only way that he can get out of the tree is if Jack allows him out. So Jack makes a deal with the devil and says, I'll let you down, but you can never take me to hell. You can never have my soul. So the devil agrees. Now, of course, anytime the quote-unquote devil shows up in Scripture, he's usually the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the devil knew what he was doing in this instance because he got out of that tree and Jack proceeded to go off and live this very, very, by standards of the day and for the purposes of the story, a very immoral kind of life. He was quite the carouser. Nobody liked him, but he figured he can literally get away with anything at this point, and there would be no consequence. But then he finds out that there is a consequence,
Right.
because he dies, and guess what? Heaven doesn't want him either.
Yeah.
So I don't know why you would then resort to, okay, well, if I have to go somewhere, I guess I'm just going to go to hell. So he goes and talks to the devil, and the devil's like, yeah, you know what? I think we're going to uphold this deal that we made. So that fated him to wandering the earth endlessly. And the whole jack-o'-lantern part of this comes from the part of the story where Jack then fashions a lantern for himself, not out of a pumpkin, but out of a turnip. So for a long, long time, that was the thing that pagan cultures would do. They would hollow out turnips,
Right.
not
pumpkins.
Not pumpkins.
Pumpkins didn't exist in Europe. I
No.
don't think. Yeah.
No, I don't think they did either. But we tend to, well, all cultures do this, where we put our own spin on a lot of these things. I personally think that a lit up pumpkin looks a lot cooler than a lit up turnip would be would be likely to be. But that's the basic story. He fashions a lantern so that he can find his way through this dark existence that he is now being forced to experience. Let's talk about a little thing called black cats. We got two of them.
Yeah. We embraced our stereotypes as Wiccans and have two black cats.
Yes, indeed. But cats, and black cats in particular, have always had this connotation of being witches' familiars.
Right.
So around this time of year, the emphasis on black cats is very stereotypical, but they also kind of look neat in pictures and other forms of visualization too.
Oh, sure.
So I love both of our black cats. There's nothing mystical or magical about either of them. It's all genetics.
Yes.
But I do have a certain affection for black cats.
Yes.
And you know what they say? You know, when a black cat crosses your path,
He's going somewhere.
it's a clear sign that the animal is going somewhere.
Yes.
And that's really all there is to it. And there really isn't anything to the concept of familiars either, obviously. But the imagery I always thought was very cool. And growing up, black cats were always prevalent in Halloween imagery.
Oh, yeah.
And there are a bunch of other things. Without going too far down the rabbit hole with all the foundational stuff, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the more valid reasons why certain people and groups disliked the concept of Halloween.
Right.
Before it got its modern makeover, it was a lot different. So there were plenty of reasons to dislike the practice of Halloween, because in the very beginning, it wasn't about handing out candy to kids. It was more about mischief. Now, we've all heard about the tradition of Mischief Night.
Right.
I haven't seen anything like that in a very, very long time. I remember hearing about Mischief Night last when I was in high school, mid, late 80s. But I suppose it depends on where you live, what the circumstances are. I know that it hasn't really been a thing around here.
No.
I haven't heard of anything happening in years and years that would be attributable to Mischief Night, although there are still plenty of people that are bugaboo about it and tell you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to keep your lights on, you need to make sure that your cars are secure and all that. I haven't seen anything around here to suggest that this is still something that happens, but it was a throwback to some of the more original happenings around Halloween, people definitely used this time of year as an excuse to play a lot of pranks.
Oh, sure.
And some of those pranks were really innocuous. Let's think in the realm of your flaming bag of poo, for example.
Ew.
There was silly stuff like that.
Right.
But then there was stuff that was more serious, like setting fires and out of control fires that start out a lot of times as bonfires that aren't kept in check.
Right.
But there was flat out arson, there was flat out vandalism, and lots of general mischief that frightened children and seniors and literally managed to scare some people to death.
Yeah.
And these sorts of things went on for a long time in Europe and did eventually make their way to the States. Irish and Scottish immigrants were making Halloween mischief right up into the 1920s. And that was when organized trick-or-treating was adopted as a means of quelling the mischief and giving people something less destructive to do
Right.
during this time of year. The participation of children was also significant because most people still had no desire or intention to harm children. So you kind of set up the children as the pawns on the chessboard, and it kind of created a little bit more of a sense of security. It made people less prone to do things that were really destructive because they didn't want kids getting tangled up in it. So, I mean, think about it. Lots of kids around. Be careful what you decide to set on fire.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to kill anybody, and especially not a child.
Right.
But in the early 20th century is when we started seeing the more contemporary version of this emerge. Sometime in the 1920s, things kind of shifted. Irish and Scottish communities revived a lot of these old world traditions of things like souling and guising and brought these things to the United States. So you're starting to see things start to come together. It's not just about mischief. It's about the idea of going door to door,
Right.
of dressing up, because that's what those things are all about. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in just a second. But by the 1920s, pranks had become the Halloween activity of choice, especially for bored teenagers.
Of course.
I mean, no cell phones, no cars. What else are you going to do? You're going to start setting shit on fire.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, yeah.
I work with teenagers every day. I totally and completely get the mentality here. You're young. You still feel like you're immortal. You don't have the sense of consequences to your actions that you should.
Yeah.
And this is the type of thing that happens. But those same bored teenagers seem to have no problem begging the neighbors for candy. So it was the children, and then it was the older children in the form of teenagers that were involved in trick-or-treat, and they would just go door to door, which is a throwback to the tradition of souling. Now, what souling involved was there were no masks or costumes. It was a time when the poorer people in the community would go door to door and basically begging for what were called soul cakes. So this
Right.
was their version of trick or treat, but it was more about subsistence and survival than it was about having fun. It's just that it turned into a tradition that took place around this time of year. And it also helped people out going into the winter months where food was already beginning to get sparse.
Right.
And it helped to maintain that community structure because there's going to be people in every social strata and every economic strata in every community. So in this instance, it was just one of the ways that the haves took a little bit better care of the have-nots. Guising did have its roots in disguise.
Yes.
Well, that's pretty
Guising.
much what the word says. It says it right there. Guising, disguise, yes.
Yeah.
So that's where the concept of putting on a mask or putting on a costume came into existence. And the early traditions of that had to do with fooling the evil spirits
Yes.
and keeping death at bay. So when the veil between the worlds is thinnest, that's when you kind of want to hide from death,
Yeah.
because those two worlds are so close to each other and death is literally at your door. So you put on a disguise and you disguise yourself as a demon or a gargoyle or something of that
Yeah.
realm, so that when death comes around playing the friend or foe game, you want to be recognized as friend, not foe.
Right.
That's pretty much it. So all of these things eventually kind of melded together. So you've got communities that want to quell some of the vandalism and some of the pranking and some of the mischief that's going on. And there's these other two traditions of going door to door and dressing up. And all of a sudden, boom, you've got the contemporary version of Halloween that starts in the 1920s. But this is another thing that I found interesting in my research. The phrase trick or treat was not always associated with this. It was something that did crop up over time, and it can be traced back to the 1920s. But oddly enough, and I wasn't even aware of this, how contemporary this was.
Right.
Oddly enough, it wasn't until the 1950s when it really became mainstream. And another thing that I wasn't aware of was that the use of the term trick or treat in a more widespread way with this tradition was really the invention of pop culture. It started out with a Peanuts cartoon.
Yeah.
But the real momentum came from a Disney cartoon of the same title. It was just titled Trick or Treat. So from that point forward, the practice of trick or treat really, really skyrocketed. And not only did it become a mainstream thing, but it also spurred on at least one or two, well, more than one or two. It spurred on several industries.
Oh, yeah.
Candy makers who were no longer rationing sugar because of World War II were now making candy en masse.
Yes.
They were making a lot of candy. And at this time of year, there was a huge market for it. So, Halloween for the candy industry is pretty much Black Friday.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to sell
Definitely.
most of their product in this very, very small window of time within about a month.
Yeah.
And that's still true today because, usually around the end of August, you start seeing the Halloween candy showing up in stores. And by the time November 1st rolls around, well, everything's 75% off. But they're still making a tidy profit.
Oh,
That's the
definitely.
crazy part. They're still making a tidy profit on it. So you have the candy industry that skyrockets this time of year.
Yeah.
And then you've got all the companies that make the costumes.
Right.
Because there's a lot of costuming that goes on around Halloween that doesn't for the rest of the year. Even to the point where in the last more than a decade now, I'd say it's got to be at least 20 years that you've seen the seasonal stores cropping up, like Spirit Halloween and the others that are out there.
Oh, yeah.
You
Definitely.
see a lot of this. And again, in a very, very short amount of time, this is an entire industry that's making most of its money for the year.
Right.
So Halloween has had kind of a dubious past, but in terms of economics, in terms of commerce, it's actually a really, really lucrative time of year. And that is true despite all the Christian influence and the idea and concept of avoiding the very appearance of evil, which I'm going to talk about also in a little while here. Another of the pagan traditions that revolves around this is the tradition of mummering, which is basically ritual dance.
Right.
And it's not just a Samhain thing, but it does play heavily into Samhain and other Samhain-related festivals and practices like the Day of the Dead.
Right.
There are mummers dances for pretty much every season of the year and probably every Sabbath. I'm pretty
Probably.
sure.
Yeah.
But I have a particular affection for the Day of the Dead. I like the overall imagery of it. I like the celebratory aspect of it. And a few years ago, there was even a movie that came out that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with called The Book of Life, which is based on the whole tradition of the Day of the Dead. And one of the things that I really, really like about that movie happens early on, where you see all of the families and they're all gathered together in their little spaces. And part of the tradition is leaving space for people who have gone before at your table, setting places for them and everything. And one of the neatest parts of that movie was in the beginning where you see people sitting, basically social distancing around a table. And then all of a sudden, these blue apparitions of the people in their lives that have gone before just sort of appear there before them and with them, rather. Which, obviously, as an atheist, I don't believe that that's a thing that happens, that it literally happens. But it goes back to the concept of remembrance, which I've now teased twice, and we're going to get into in more detail in a minute. I kind of steered off a little bit with the stuff about Day of the Dead, but we were originally talking about the economic
Right.
impact of Halloween. And I found an interesting little statistic here. Today, Americans spend an estimated $2.6 billion on candy just for Halloween.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of sugar. That's a lot of sugar, a lot of carbs. It's a recipe for diabetes. But I've learned over time. I've learned to be careful.
Yeah.
With the Halloween candy. And one of the things that I like about Halloween candy is that they're usually the little fun size things. There's a lot of small versions of these larger candy bars because I can't do a whole candy bar anymore.
Oh God. No.
But I can absolutely get a little bite of Twix and be satisfied with it, or a little Snickers bar and be satisfied with just that. I don't need 15 of them.
Right.
So as far as I'm concerned, Halloween is a friendly time for me because it allows me to have a little bit of a treat too, without having to try to make my way through an entire Snickers bar, which I don't think that I would be able to do at this point anyway. But $2.6 billion, my goodness, that is a lot of candy.
A lot of candy.
A lot of candy. I went looking for numbers in terms of costumes and costume supplies and crafts and whatnot, and I think that the range for that is just a little bit too broad to really narrow it down.
It's too much.
But the craft stores, I'm sure, do really, really well at this time of year too.
Oh yeah, that stuff is gone by the second week of October because they're getting ready for Thanksgiving and Christmas by then.
But I would imagine that most of it goes earlier than that because if you're a crafter, you need time to put your stuff together.
You need time to put your stuff
I mean, we knew crafters that specialized in Christmas stuff, and they started doing their work in July.
Oh yeah.
So but this time of year, fabric, especially this year with all the masks.
Oh yeah.
I imagine they're selling a lot of themed
fabric.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got my orange spider mask, and that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But moving along just a little bit with this, I want to kind of shift the focus over to the evangelical aspect of all of this.
Right.
Now, what I found really, really interesting when I was in the thick of evangelical religion was the lack of commentary that there was about Halloween in general. I literally, and I sat here and I tried to go back in my head. I tried to remember if there was anything that they tried to indoctrinate us with in youth group about this, if there were any videos, if there were any lame-ass Christian movies that we were made to watch. I can't remember a single example of being sat down and being given any kind of pep talk about Halloween, having anything to do with anything evil or whatnot. I mean, you always know what their opinions are on these things, and I'm going to touch on that in a sec too. But this particular practice is one where there is so much disparity of opinion that I think that a lot of churches tend to just kind of want to leave it alone and provide their own alternatives to it. But evangelicals, at least in the circles that I moved in, they didn't often outright condemn Halloween. But here's the thing. They really didn't have to. They don't have to as a general rule. Because instead of aiming the crosshairs at the holiday itself, they make people fear everything associated with it.
Right.
So they don't have to tell you don't go trick-or-treating because they've already told you that things like ghosts, witches, devils, and demons are evil. Take all of those things and put them in one place, and at that point, do they really need to condemn it outright?
Not really.
No, because it's already in your head that these things are bad. Mm-hmm. So you're going to try to do what it says in 1 Thessalonians 5:22 and abstain from the very appearance of evil. So that's an all-encompassing thing that very, very succinctly covers Halloween for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then there are those evangelicals who have just enough of that rational mind going on in there to realize that this is about kids and candy.
Yeah.
And we're going to let our kids do it. I was a fence sitter about this for a long time. And I guess around 86, 87, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but I think that that was close to it because I had been a Christian for like a year or two and started feeling quote unquote convicted about the whole Halloween thing.
Right.
And kind of tossed it aside for a lot of years when I was a teenager. There's no doubt that Halloween deals with some dark subjects and reminds us about things like death and the morbid thoughts that we all have about ourselves or people who have passed. And evangelicals don't really like it when people start thinking about death in the wrong context.
Yeah.
They want you thinking about it from the standpoint of heaven and hell and what the consequence is to you if you reject the gospel. The thing about Halloween and everything that revolves around it is that it does kind of shift your focus toward the macabre just a little bit.
Yeah.
It gets you thinking about death. And some of the imagery around Halloween can, with certain people and in certain contexts, take on more of a positive. Things like the Day of the Dead.
Right.
And the thought of having your departed loved ones literally right there and enjoying a meal with you in a spiritual, metaphysical sort of way.
Right.
So most evangelicals do not like the idea of death being painted in any kind of positive light. And Sugar Skulls, the artwork that is associated with the Day of the Dead, the flowing costumes, bright, bright colors. I mean, in America, when we think about death, we think about dressing in black and going to funerals.
Right.
But in this context, it's about romanticizing
Yeah.
the concept of death, where now you've got all of this colorful imagery and a celebratory attitude about it. No, evangelicals don't want us thinking in those terms. They don't want us thinking along those lines about death. So what do? They do what they do with everything else, and they take the indoctrination and slide it all in under the radar so that when the time comes for you to decide whether or not you want to be involved in this, it's already in your head that this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. And that works out well in their favor because then it shifts the focus of all things macabre from having a positive spin
Right.
to having the negative spin that it deserves, because if you die without Jesus, you're going to hell. And that's what they want you thinking about.
Of course.
They don't want you thinking about any of the positives that are associated with this, whether they're realistic or not. I mean, like I said, the whole concept behind the Day of the Dead obviously is not literal and it's not real, but it does help you feel better. And it helps you feel better about people who have gone before, and it helps you feel a little bit better about your own mortality.
Right.
And that's another thing that they don't like. They don't like you being comfortable with the notion of your mortality. They want you fearing death to the point where you reach out to Jesus so that when you do die, bad things don't happen to you. And a lot of times they'll pull out Philippians 4:8 as a reference here for why you shouldn't do certain things. And they may not always come out and place Halloween in this list. But like I said, everything associated with it it's the opposite of what's being talked about here in Paul's letter to the Philippians. In Philippians 4:8, you know what? There are so many whatsoevers in here.
It's a lot of whatsoever.
I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit just to cut down on the whatsoevers. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. So then they turn that around and say, well, what's virtuous about this, that, and the other associated with Halloween? So by process of elimination, pretty much everything that's associated with it, at least on a surface level, falls under this category of things that we shouldn't be dwelling on.
Right.
So that right there, without ever saying don't trick or treat, don't dress up, don't do whatever it is that you're going to do revolving around this satanic holiday, falling short of saying any of that, all they have to do is pull out that one verse. Well, those two verses, the one from Philippians and the one from 1 Thessalonians about avoiding the very appearance of evil. We talked about this a second ago, but I'm going to touch on it again real quick here. Halloween to the evangelical also glamorizes hell and a lot of the concepts that they want painted in a more negative light become more positive. And we talked about the ways that that's accomplished a couple of minutes ago. They don't want you participating in Halloween in secular form because of the connotation there.
Right.
But they're fine with their own versions of things.
Oh, yes.
And I can remember two very, very vividly from my church days. For the children, we had what was called the Fall Fun Party, or Fall Fun Night, or Fall Fun Family Night, depending on who was naming it that year. But it was basically the same thing. And all it was a glorified trick or treat, and really an indoor trunk or treat.
Right.
Was more to the point, because they had stations set up in the gymnasium at church where the kids would go. And I mean, I'm sorry, I heard most of them saying trick or treat
Yeah.
as they went up to these stations. And I mean, they were all like biblical stories.
Yeah.
And they were all Christian images and whatnot. And the kids were being indoctrinated as they went.
Right.
There were little stories. There were little tracts. There were all kinds of things that made sure that they understood that they were still at church. But they got candy out of it. And then there were games. Yes, they did the bobbing for apples thing for the kids. They kind of cheated and put the apples on strings so that they kind of touched the water, but you could get them.
Yeah.
And if you really wanted to, you could just sort of grab the string for the kid. The games were all the same traditional things that you would see.
Sure.
Not so much pumpkin carving because there were kids involved, but they definitely decorated pumpkins. They pulled out the magic markers or the paint or whatever it was, and they decorated pumpkins. So that's okay in the context of church, as long as they're allowed the opportunity to indoctrinate you as part of it. That makes it okay. For the teenagers, we had our harvest socials.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, I enjoyed our harvest socials, but they bore a shocking resemblance to what we would do for Samhain parties and rituals and whatnot. Right down to circles and bonfires and all of the same things that years and years later I saw as part of our Wiccan community. And it was all familiar.
Yeah.
It was all stuff that I had seen before. It was all stuff that we had done before. And again, as long as there's the aspect to it that you're going to sing and chant around a fire, basically.
Yeah.
But as long as the youth pastor delivers a sermon at the end and you get indoctrinated, it's fine.
Yeah.
Some of my better memories of youth group revolved around these particular parties, because not only was it a fun time, I've always liked fall, I've always liked October, I've always liked the idea of warm cider and the smells of things like the bonfire and leaves falling and all of that, or fallen leaves. All the things that are associated with fall and the little nip in the air at night. I've always really enjoyed these things. But one of the things that I really liked was the venue that we did these at, because it was at the same camp that I had spent years, multiple years, as a child going to day camp. So I knew where everything was. And it was also fun to lead a couple of friends out into the woods. And we would disappear, not for long, not long enough to really be noticed, because everyone was off kind of doing their own thing outside for part of this. But there was, I'm going to readily admit, and we didn't think anything of it. We really weren't thinking that it was anything real. But there was one time when myself and several of my friends went out into the woods and decided that we were going to have a seance.
Oh, geez.
Okay, wait for it. Wait for it. To contact, please don't ask me why, to contact the spirit of George Washington. I still don't quite remember or understand what the motivation was behind this, but I will tell you, I'll give you names when we're done with this, and it will become completely and abundantly crystal clear to you why we were out there in these woods when I tell you who was involved. But no, we literally went out into the woods and we did all the things. We had, I even ganked one of the candles from the table that had all the refreshments on it. And there we were out in the middle of the woods trying to rap with George Washington. So you can put it in any context that you want. It starts, your brain starts moving in the direction of the spirit of the events.
Yeah.
And that's what causes like 5 or 6 teenage boys to venture out into the woods at a youth camp. And in the middle of their church's harvest social, start trying to contact George Washington in the woods. I still, you know what? If I spent enough time thinking about it, I might be able to come up with the details as to why it was George Washington and not someone else. I mean, if I had my choice of historical figures to contact, I sincerely doubt that George Washington would have been the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah.
But that's where we were, and that's what we were doing. Please don't ask me why. I haven't the slightest fucking clue at this point. It was,
Yeah.
30 years ago?
I think that our youth group also did harvest parties as well. They weren't as nice as the one you're describing, but they were there. We could dress up as long as we didn't have any disgusting costumes.
Right. That was
You know,
always that was always a stipulation.
no devil stuff.
Nope.
No witches. None of that.
Nope.
As long as it wasn't gross.
Yep, and it was always on the flyers for the
Yeah.
kids event at church too. There was always a little bit of a disclaimer about, we're perfectly okay with your child coming in costume, but no ghosts, ghouls, witches, whatever. And there was a sizable list of things that they didn't want. So,
yeah.
I mean, honestly, what we wound up with was a parade of either biblical characters or like Disney characters, and that was pretty much it.
Yep.
A lot of biblical characters, a lot of Moses costumes, you name it. Samson was another one. The little boys with the costumes that made their chests look bigger than their head. Yeah. And it was obvious who they were supposed to be, but of course I would always walk, who are you supposed to be? I'm Samson. Of course you are. Of course you are. Here, have a Snickers.
In high school, I always went on Halloween dressed as a hippie. It was the easiest costume, and I already had all the clothes for it, so...
Yeah, you did.
I did.
I remember what your wardrobe looked like. You definitely did. One thing that the evangelicals do like to pull out as warnings, that, again, there's usually never a direct admonishment, at least not in the circles that I was in, but they're more subtle about it, and they pull out warnings that are largely based on long since debunked urban legends.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll start talking about the risks that are involved with trick-or-treating because you're going to get tainted candy and sweets. I thought that it was interesting when I was researching this. One of the biggest tie-ins, and I can remember being told stories about tainted candy long before the mid-'80s or whenever this happened.
Oh, yeah.
Because I was in our neighborhood in Hyde Park and trick-or-treating through all the various neighborhoods that were in this one generalized area, and my grandmother pulling out the urban legends about poison candy and razor blades and whatnot.
Yep.
But the bottom line with this is that there was never really anything to any of this, that it was largely and almost completely urban legend with just a couple of exceptions. But I was looking at an article from history.com. I actually went out looking for information on this to see how some of these rumors started getting spread. And just like any good urban legend, it is difficult to trace back the origins of some of these. So I was actually interested to see if this was something that Christianity had decided they were going to perpetuate just to make people scared. I didn't see any direct evidence of that.
Right.
And again, just like any urban legend, it's usually, I know somebody who knew somebody who saw this kind of thing. But I'm going to read just a quick quote from this article from history.com. It says, fears of Halloween sadism rise during fearful times. For example, paranoia about tainted candy spiked in the early 1980s after a rash of Tylenol poisonings in which cyanide-laced acetaminophen was placed on store shelves and sold. The high-profile crime led to the introduction of childproof containers and tough federal laws aimed at punishing those who tamper with drugs. After the Tylenol murders, which are still unsolved, warnings about adulterated Halloween candy increased. So we heard more about it in the 80s for two reasons. It was this, with the whole Tylenol thing, and I believe wholeheartedly that the satanic panic fueled it a lot.
Oh, I'm sure.
So not just the whole thing about tainted sweets, but everything negative that you ever heard about Halloween and all the urban legends kind of came to a head around the mid-'80s.
Definitely.
Now, here's the thing. There are only a couple actual cases of even potential poisoning. This is still from the article, related to trick-or-treat. One of them involved a crazy lady who handed out ant poison in New York in 1964 and wrote it off as a prank. But then there was this marvelous piece of humanity, and this is where most of the scare around this came from, because this was just a couple years before I started trick-or-treating, and these are the details that I got from my grandmother. Now, keep in mind, this was one incident.
Yeah.
But when people get scared, things tend to balloon up. So there were all kinds of other details, and I was told to be careful of a lot of things that were probably completely innocuous. I don't know how much candy I was forced to throw away.
Oh, yeah.
That was perfectly okay, because she would look at something and say, oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But there's honestly very, very little to be worried about here. But here's what one really nice guy did back in 1974. Again, from the History.com article, the most infamous Halloween poisoning took place on October 31st, 1974. That's when a Texas man named Ronald O'Brien gave cyanide-laced pixie sticks to 5 children, including his son. The other children never ate the candy, but his 8-year-old son, Timothy, did, and, of course, died soon after. Though nobody saw O'Brien put the cyanide in the candy, investigators learned that O'Brien had recently taken life insurance policies out on his children. He was convicted of murder and executed via lethal injection in 1984. Though it's been decades since the crime, the Candyman murder still looms large in the memories of many parents on Halloween. And it's one of the main things that fuels the whole tainted candy thing, even today. But it was one incident,
guy.
and that was it. Trick or treat is safe. By and large, trick or treat is very, very safe. And most of the terrible things that we hear about, razor blades in the apples, I went looking for information on this and found a whole article on it that I'm not going to really get into. Just suffice it to say that that is also urban myth. That there is not, nor have there ever been, any documented cases of someone sabotaging an apple or anything else, doing things that are going to intentionally harm children. These things just flat out don't happen unless you wind up tangling with some crackpot like Ronald O'Brien.
Yeah.
And he's gone now. And good riddance. Taking out insurance policies on your kids and killing them so you can cash in. I mean, how do you how do you even spend that money? How do you spend that much blood money and give yourself a comfortable life off of it, knowing where it came from?
Yeah.
It absolutely dumbfounds me. And my grandmother had all kinds of other. No, it wasn't. Let's not vilify my grandmother alone here. This was her, and there were other people in our neighborhood that told other stories.
Oh, yeah.
I had heard tell and never, and I even actually Googled this to find out if it was something that actually happened, and never found anything on this either. But I remember my grandmother telling me a story about a kid who went out for Halloween in military garb and knocked on the door of an ex-soldier who apparently had PTSD, who then went and grabbed his gun and gunned down the kid. Now, that was one story that I was told. Other things that circulated through our neighborhood were things like, don't go to that house because last year that lady was handing out cookies made with cat food. And don't go to this house because we found blood in the cookies from this house. And now, if I came home with cookies at all, I was told to throw them out, which kind of sucks because people work hard on that stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of sucks, but when you're buying into the kind of paranoia that makes people perpetuate these urban myths about razor blades and apples and poison and candy, then you sort of kind of understand. But my grandmother was very overprotective, and I stood there and watched my friends eat the same stuff that I was told to throw away, and they all survived.
Yeah.
And just on a little bit more of a personal note with us, the other thing that crops up every year, and especially with the advent of social media, I see this every single year, about people handing out things laced with LSD, handing out marijuana brownies and other pot edibles just to pull one over on your kids. Let me make sure that we understand a couple of things here. First and foremost, no one, or hardly anyone, I can't say for sure because I'm not omnipresent, but I can say that if this happens, it's such a rarity that it's not even worth discussing. If someone was lacing candy with LSD, we would know about it.
Yeah.
So no one is giving your kids LSD-laced candies, and no one is giving your kids weed edibles. How do I know this? Well, let me explain this in a way that most people will be able to understand, okay? Drugs, in general, are expensive. Now, when you live in Massachusetts, weed is uber expensive. I mean, I'm going to throw out some numbers here that certain people in other parts of the country where it's legal are going to hear this and their jaws are going to drop. But keep in mind, I worked in a dispensary for 2 years. Almost $500 for an ounce on the recreational side.
Yeah.
Okay. Medical is not that bad. Usually between $300 and $350 for an ounce, but still $350 for an ounce of marijuana. And in a lot of other places, those numbers are cut in half and even by less than that. Who is going to spend that kind of money to play a prank on a kid? In order to make enough pot brownies to hand out to unsuspecting kiddies, it would easily cost the amount that you would pay for an ounce, sometimes more, sometimes even twice as much as that. It depends on how many you're making and how strong you want them to be.
Right.
Even at half the price. Why on earth would I go through the trouble of making the butter, which takes time, and it sacrifices a lot of product? Then I have to make the brownies, and then I'm going to just pass my medicine, because that's what it is to me, out to a bunch of kids whose parents are going to probably chuck them anyway.
Right.
Because that's what happens with stuff that you bake and hand out on Halloween. So who on earth is going to go to all that trouble and all of that expense just to play a prank on a kid that they will never see the outcome of?
Right.
It makes absolutely no sense. No one is putting pot brownies in your kids' bags.
No.
Okay? And if they are, I would assume the parents are probably getting to them first. Happy Halloween.
Yeah.
But no, there's no possible way. I don't know how much money anybody else out there makes. I know for me, even at the levels that I can get my stuff, it's way too expensive for me to even consider doing something like that. So don't perpetuate this stuff. No one is trying to drug your kids with the drugs that they spent their hard-earned money on. No, that's not happening. Out of the urban legends that I've listed here tonight, none of them have their roots in evangelical religion. But what is the biggest motivator when it comes to evangelicals and the way that they do anything? What is it? It's fear. It's fear, pure and simple. So at that point, if they can heap a bunch of unsubstantiated nonsense onto the fire and get you to run from it, that's what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. Many Christians believe all of the stories that I just told as much as they believe their Bibles, which, I mean, to me makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because when you are in that mindset of not looking for proof for anything, then that's what happens. You start taking everything at face value, and whether you believe it or not, if it reinforces your argument, you're going to use it.
Yeah.
And that's what happens in a lot of evangelical circles. Looking at this from a little bit more of a personal standpoint, I'm not going to get terribly far into it because there honestly isn't a whole heck of a lot to tell. My relationship with Halloween ended when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And just like what happened when I became an atheist, there wasn't really anything that I could backtrack to and say this was the thing that did it, that made me stop believing. It was a process. It took place over a lot of years. And when I finally admitted to myself that there's really nothing bigger than me out there in this universe in terms of anything that has power over me, it wasn't a conscious decision that was made. It was just something that I came to understand over time. And with Halloween, I just came to understand the innocuous nature of it over time. But I did just completely stop doing anything Halloween related around the time of the Satanic Panic. And I think it had a lot more to do with that than it did with any other influences, because I knew a lot of kids, even in youth group, that went trick-or-treating, and it didn't bother me that they went trick-or-treating. Some that were very, very hardline evangelical, but had parents who were just practical enough to understand that this is just a kid thing.
Yeah.
But for me, I was trying to do what it says in 1 Thessalonians and avoid the appearance of evil. And that, to me, was the bottom line for it. There was enough of a quote-unquote satanic connotation to it that I didn't really want myself associated with it, especially being that I was somewhat of a leader in my youth group. I was going into the ministry. It didn't bode well with me telling youth group members that this was an okay thing to do. So I just sort of decided this is going to be a practice what you preach kind of thing, and I just stopped having anything to do with Halloween. Fast forward 2 years, and there I am sitting there with you in the co-ed dorm at Valley Forge Christian College.
Yeah.
And it's Halloween night, and I don't know whether we even had plans, if we were just chilling out. And all of a sudden, what happens? Like 5 girls come out in costumes, and they're carrying pillowcases. And I'm looking at this, and I'm like, at my Christian college? This is something that's about to happen? And as I'm thinking it, someone from my home church walks out that door dressed as one of the California Raisins. And are you quite serious? Is this really something that's happening? I didn't confront anyone. This is all going on in my head. I was a legalistic little prick. I really was. But I didn't know these people from Adam. I had been on campus for like a month and a half.
Right.
So when this happened, I'm just sort of sitting there and kind of scratching my head. Is this allowed? Are these people going to get written up? Are there going to be problems? Are we going to hear more about mass disciplinary actions after this? But here's the thing. Later that night, I go back to my dorm and I see some of the guys coming in costume with weighted down pillowcases.
Oh, boy.
So there were a lot of people on that campus that still went trick-or-treating.
Yep.
Now, in retrospect, it probably shouldn't have surprised me that much because I did see a lot of my friends do it. I saw parents show up at our door with their kids for Halloween that we knew from church. And, it never really occurred to me to judge them, but I always questioned, why would you even do this? Why would you even want to do this? It wasn't like, oh, you're a terrible person and you're a bad Christian for doing it. Just like, why is it a priority? Because aren't we supposed to be avoiding the very appearance of evil? And aren't there particularly evil connotations to what goes on with Halloween? Well, no, there really aren't. We've just been told that there are. So our brains start working in that direction, and everything now feels like it's evil if it's associated with Halloween.
Yeah.
But honestly, I knew a lot of evangelicals that had enough sense to understand that they were doing this for their kids and that it was just a kid thing. The other part was the whole thing with Santa Claus.
Yeah.
You remember the conversations that we had before Liam was born about what we were going to allow him to believe about that?
Yeah.
Because we wanted to keep his thoughts based in reality about things like Jesus. Mm-hmm. Keep his thoughts based in reality about things like Jesus and not let him go trick-or-treating and not let him believe in Santa Claus. But here's the thing. Here's the thing with evangelical parents. I think that in a lot of these instances, when it comes down to things that are associated with childhood, I think that a lot of them weigh the consequences of shunning their kid from these things against letting them have them. And especially with something like Santa Claus. I don't want to be the parent that starts getting phone calls from the school because my pious little baby is telling all of his friends that Santa Claus is not real and that they need to repent and turn to Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. This is not where I kind of want to find myself. I also wouldn't want my kid growing up with a skewed sense of what their childhood was. And for me, that was the thing with Liam. My adolescence got skewed off into a tangent when I decided to attend Word of Life Island. My entire adolescence and young adulthood and even like right up into my 40s got skewed off into this tangent.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things that I consider to be normal about a typical teenage existence and the experiences that you have that I never got to take part in. I never got to take part in what I consider to be a normal college experience either. And these things started weighing on my mind when it came down to making the decision of how we were going to approach these issues with our own kid. Mm-hmm. And my thought there was, and again, I had enough of a rational mind to understand intellectually that when it came to Halloween, that it was completely innocuous.
Right.
It was about putting on a costume and begging for candy.
Yeah.
And that was it. So when I thought about it in terms of my own kid, I also thought, you know what? Let Liam have a childhood.
I was so happy.
It was the same thing. It was the same conclusion that I came to about Santa Claus.
Right.
Let your kid have a childhood. And this is part of it. So that to me was most of my way out of this shunning Halloween mindset.
Yeah.
I mean, our lights were off for a lot of years. We ignored that door for a lot of years. And I so wish that I could have taken more of a part in watching these little kids' faces light up when they got candy and smiling and hearing them say trick or treat. I missed out on a lot of that for me.
Yeah.
And we missed out on a lot of it and just sort of sat there on our couch and tried to pretend that Halloween wasn't happening. Mm-hmm. And I so regret that now.
Yeah.
I really regret it.
Halloween was just sort of my major holiday. This was my favorite holiday. And that's including Christmas, which for a little kid is weird. Because usually, Christmas is when you get the presents. But
yeah, but Halloween is when you get the candy.
Just fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just fun. You went out at night. I mean, and little kids don't go out at night,
Right.
You have to wait till dark because then it's dark. It's really cool. And then you get to put on a costume and be weird.
Yep.
It was my favorite holiday. And it was my favorite holiday up until I went to college. And then I figured I had to kind of not do that anymore.
Right. But then there were plenty of people right there in our midst who were, and there were no consequences for it. That was the thing that bothered me more than anything.
Right.
Was, okay, I kind of like these people. I sure hope that I see them again on November 1st.
Yeah. But it is weird because it's like they do this and it's like, well, wait, I guess maybe not. It was very confusing because I really didn't know what way to think about it.
Well, my mother put it kind of succinctly at one point, and I don't even remember what the context of the conversation was, but we were talking about something, and I don't remember what the conversation was about at this point. But I remember my mother just sort of looking at me and shrugging and saying, well, there are Christians, and then there are Christians. So I guess what she meant by that is that there are some Christians that can think more practically about certain things than others. And at the end of the day, I feel like this happens a lot, that it wasn't something that was just a personal epiphany. I think a lot of people start reassessing some of the things that they believe and some of the things that they say they're going to do with their kids before they have kids.
Yeah.
Because I was very, very staunch on the idea of keeping Christ in Christmas and not doing the Santa Claus thing.
Yeah.
And avoiding the appearance of evil and not putting my kid in a costume and bringing him trick-or-treating. I thought that would make me a good Christian parent. Well, I decided to just be a good parent.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to be the good Christian parent and let my kid do the things that kids are going to do. And I am very, very happy that we made that decision and allowed him to experience those things, because I had loads of fun the years that I took him trick-or-treat when he was little, and we would just go to the mall.
Yeah,
and
we
go
would
to
just
all
go
the
to
mall
the mall.
stores.
They loved him.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Liam loved the mall.
Yep.
I mean, always. He's always loved the mall.
Yep. And when he got a little bit older, we would start taking him into other neighborhoods.
Right.
And just sort of follow him with the car.
Yeah.
And the excitement when he got something good.
Yeah.
I feel like if you're a parent and you're not allowing your kids to do this, that you are missing out. And you're missing out more than they will.
Oh, yeah.
Because they'll never know how much fun it is.
Yeah.
But most of us who grew up in more traditional families.
Yeah.
And even quite a few who grew up in hardline evangelical families know what it's like. So if you take that away from your kid and you have experience with it, I think that it's a lot worse.
Yeah.
Because you are the one that made that decision to not let your kid have that thing.
Yeah.
And I just did not want to be that parent.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that I allowed my focus to shift enough to allow my kid to have that.
Yeah.
I really am.
One of the best times were the couple of times that we took Liam trick-or-treating in Pittsfield.
Oh, yeah.
Like we would go to my dad's house and we'd go trick-or-treating. And then my son would come home, and I'm like looking through his stuff, and like, oh my God, the guy with the comic books is still giving out comic books. The guy giving stamps out is still giving out like bunches of like foreign stamps.
I'm sure that was neat. I never had anything like that.
And like the guy who always gave out toothbrushes is still giving out toothbrushes. All these guys were in my neighborhood growing up, and he must have caught them just before they must have passed away at some point. But
yeah, because they were old when you were a kid.
They were older when I was a kid, and I'm like, they're still around. They're still giving out the same thing.
That's so neat. I don't know if I've ever had this conversation with you before. You see, I don't get that because of where I lived and where we've lived since and all of that. And even so, I can't really pinpoint houses where I got certain things or anything like that. It was pretty much the same every year. But it's neat that you had those memories and were able to look through that bag, and it was like looking through a time machine.
It really was. And I'm like, I can't believe these people are still there. They're still there.
Yep. And still obviously love Halloween.
Oh, well, Pittsfield is a big Halloween town.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. They even do the parade.
Yeah, they do a parade.
I don't know about this year.
And I don't know how many years they've done it, but they would hold a Halloween parade. I don't think it was on Halloween night. It was on one of the weeks leading up. But they would have it at night, and all the little kids would come by class in school dressed up in a certain way. They had a theme every year, so it was pretty cool.
Yeah, it all sounds really, really neat. There weren't those kind of structured traditions for me. I mean, my Catholic school did that kind of thing. They called it a Halloween party. They just got right to the chase and called it a Halloween party, and there were no restrictions on costumes. There were plenty of little devils running around. As far as Halloween tradition, that's kind of where it began and ended with me. I have more vivid memories of what happened in youth group around this time of year, because the harvest socials were fun.
Oh, yeah.
The people who organized them, I'm sorry, they had a closet love for Halloween.
Oh, of course.
And they did it right.
Yeah.
But that's the closest that I have to anything like what you're describing. I couldn't tell you that we would go to the same person's house every year and get the same stuff. The only exception to that was one neighbor who we really trusted, who made, I mean, the recipe is the same everywhere, but there was something about this lady's Toll House cookies that were just the bomb.com long before there was a .com. Okay. And those were the only baked goods that I was allowed to actually have. They had to come from this family because they were trusted.
Yeah.
And oh my God, the cookies, those cookies. And she made them for a lot of different occasions, but I don't know how much time leading up to Halloween she spent baking, but she had stacks and stacks of these cookies. And if you just rode your bike into her part of the neighborhood a couple days before Halloween, it smelled like a Toll House cookie factory. So, and the same thing at Christmas, because she did a lot of Christmas cookies too. But the Toll House cookies were the signature thing.
Yeah.
And I found myself playing in vicinity of their house more than a few times, knowing full well that I was going to be called over to have one of those cookies.
Here, you could test one.
Oh, yeah. No, it wasn't even a matter of that. These were older people who most of their family was all over the place.
Yeah.
And they just like kids.
Yeah.
They loved the kids in the neighborhood. And it was not at all uncommon for me to just be invited in for a glass of milk and a cookie. And at Halloween, it was even better because, it really, really smelled like they were producing them commercially there for a little while.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is the closest thing that I have to a memory like that. Halloween was pretty much the same every year. It was pretty generic. We got the same candy from a lot of different places. So many Smarties. So many Smarties. And circus peanuts. Ugh. Oh, God, so many circus peanuts. But that was the 70s for you. You know what I mean? That was
Smarties
it.
and circus peanuts.
And those god-awful plastic costumes. You got the plastic mask.
Yes, from Collegeville Costume Factory.
Yeah. Yep.
We went to college right around there.
Yes, indeed, we did. But the one thing that I liked about those is that if it was raining, the costume was kind of a poncho.
Yeah, it's sort of like waterproof. It was plastic. It was completely plastic.
Yep.
You make a dress out of plastic, you slap a couple characters' faces on there, really creepy faces,
Yeah.
and the title of the show and their costume.
And you would boil in those masks.
Oh my
You
God,
would
the masks were
absolutely
so
boil.
hot.
Yeah.
I can still remember how they smelled.
Oh, yeah.
That's
They
kinda-
had a distinct smell. They
Yes.
totally did. And it felt so good when you leave somebody's house and you're just sort of walking down the street to the next person's house to pull that mask off and that rush of cool air.
Yeah.
And then you just let the mask air out
Yeah.
and you let it dry out. And then by the time you get to the next house, it's comfortable enough to be able to say trick or treat, and then you're sweltering again.
Yeah.
But
But at least you're staying warm.
yeah, but like I said, that was the 70s. That was what we did.
Yep.
And I'll tell you, that company made a killing.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Definitely.
And I don't know where any of their founding members are at this point, but I'm guessing that they are doing well. I'm guessing that
Yeah.
they've got more money than their grandkids are going to be able to spend.
Yeah, I can kind of imagine that.
Yeah. So, when you look at it from a purely secular standpoint, there are so many advantages to having this as part of our culture that it really kind of drowns out anything that could have a quote unquote evil connotation to it.
Yeah.
Because Halloween in and of itself is pretty much about costumes and candy.
Yeah.
It's the other stuff, it's the other traditions that most Christians and especially evangelicals will have a problem with. And little, if any, of that stuff is even involved in the process of trick or treat.
Oh, no. Yeah.
There are the pagan origins of going door to door and wearing costumes, but these things were done in different contexts.
Right.
So it was just something that was adopted and hybridized to the point where it turned into something fun for kids to do.
Yeah.
And that was it. And that was the beginning and end of any spiritual connotation to it, especially after the 1950s. So just a few closing thoughts here. Just to put a cap on everything that we talked about tonight, while there are a few historical reasons to be skeptical about Halloween, and yes, Mischief Night is still a phrase that gets tossed around, but it's been years since I've seen anything beyond strewn toilet paper and maybe a few egged houses. And honestly, not even that much since I was younger, and since I was a teenager. Haven't really seen much of that. The basic practices of Halloween have nothing to do with any evil anything. It's a night where kids get to go have fun and largely unwittingly participate in a few practices that might be pagan in origin, but are totally and completely secular in their practice now. No one goes trick-or-treating to mock Christianity. No one goes trick-or-treating to show their allegiance to the devil. They go trick-or-treating because it's fun and they like candy. Mm-hmm. That's it. Parents participate because it makes their kids happy and because they can tap the spoils later. You know?
Of course.
Yeah, give me one of those little fun-sized Twix.
It's our parent tax.
Absolutely. It really doesn't go any further these days than a fun little cultural practice. Now, on the spiritual side of things, I personally think that there are far worse things that we do as human beings than remembering people who have passed away. And that's most of what the Samhain and Day of the Dead and All Souls Day, All Saints Day kinds of celebrations and rituals have to do with. It's okay to miss people, and honestly, it's mandatory as far as our brains are concerned to remember them. They're in there. We're going to remember them. So why not just remember them well? Our brains will not have it any other way. These memories are in there. The things that we did with these people, the things that they meant to us, all the memories, they're going to stay there whether we like it or not. So we might as well remember them and remember them fondly if that is warranted. Because I know
Right.
that there are plenty of people out there who have done a lot of damage too. And I'm not going to sit here and suggest remembering them fondly. So I know that there's a lot of baggage associated with this too. But in general, and in the context of the types of things we've been talking about tonight, we're talking about fond remembrance. That's what the Day of the Dead is all about. That's what most Samhain rituals are about, is remembering, and remembering in a positive light. Now, I don't know what Halloween's going to look like in 2020 in a lot of communities. It's probably going to be more of a non-event, which I think is very sad. I think that it's something that as a kid you look forward to all year, and even as a parent you look forward to, because it's something that makes your kids happy. In terms of the season itself, and I want to just focus on that for a couple of minutes. The season of the year is also to many about accepting and dealing with our own mortality. Forget how your pastor wants you to see this subject. Please, just for a few minutes, forget what your pastor or anyone in your church has to say about this. And take your kids trick-or-treating if it is something that you can do. In the context of the COVID crisis, there are a lot of alternatives out there. Choose something safe this year. But I'm talking in terms of just a normal year where normal things happen. And you may have a year or two to mull this one over. You may have some time to think about these words and let them sink in. But in a safe way and in a controlled way, if it's something that you can do, I think that you should definitely let your kids experience it. It won't raise as many eyebrows in your church as you think. And your kids are going to love it if they've never done it before. If you're coming out of evangelical faith and this is something that you've been contemplating and thinking about, your kids are going to really, really love this, and you're going to love their reaction to it. The prep, getting a costume together, choosing a costume, going out and trick-or-treating, coming back with loads and loads of candy. It's going to be quite the experience for them if it's something that they have not had exposure to up until now. Also, I'm going to issue a little challenge here to especially those who are either still in or getting out of evangelical faith. Also take time to observe some of the more macabre aspects of the season. Don't be afraid of the death aspect of things so much. Because if you allow yourself to, at least on an intellectual level, experience some of this stuff, it will expand your view of people and how they think about their own mortality considerably. I would even say that if you're invited to a Samhain ritual or a Day of the Dead celebration, you should go. It is possible to look at these things, in a socially distanced and safe way. I have to add these 2020 caveats to this because that's when we're doing this. It is possible to look at these things through a secular lens and learn a bit more about how we think and how we cope with the less appealing aspects of our existence, particularly our eventual non-existence. Lastly, stop letting other people dictate to you what's decent or of good report. There is love, respect, and decency in remembering those we loved who have passed and remembering them fondly. There is no dishonor or sin in taking joy in your kid's face when she runs back to you wielding the king-size Snickers she just scored. This is the good stuff, people. Let your kids be kids. Let yourself enjoy the experience of Halloween and all the diversities of celebrations that happen around this time of year. Being comfortable with these things and not being afraid of them because someone else says you should be is not just a small step. It's a huge leap you'll be taking toward getting and staying unbound. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.